You will all know the Cheviot Mountains, capped with snow and belted about by storms. They sit like a great hinge in between the two kingdoms of England and Scotland, and their slopes go down into prosperous fields. And it was at the foothills of these mountains that Marchlaw, a great grey stone farmhouse, sat. Now this was the home of Peter Elliot. Now Peter Elliot had about 500 acres, and here and there was a post or a stone, and that marked out his land. But neither he nor his neighbours took too much notice of whether their sheep strayed from one man's pasture to another, for it was in the same spirit of friendship that the masters strayed from one man's house and one man's table to another. Now, Peter Elliot was a strong, strapping man, and he was a champion at all the sports and the wrestling matches, and he was really champion in all the land between Jedburgh and Wooler. And all the competitors quailed when he was around. Now, Peter was married to Janet, and she had been his bride 20 years before, but she was still just as beautiful to him now as she was the day she walked down the aisle. Between them, they had 9 handsome children. And Janet and Peter felt themselves to be blessed. For Peter had grown richer than his fathers before him. Peter was blessed with his wife, he was blessed with his children, and he was blessed with his flocks. And all his neighbours and even his farmhands loved him. And yet still a blight was passed over the season of his plenty, and gall rained down into his cup of joy. One Christmas, when he and his family were all gathered together inside the house, there was a storm outside which was blowing. The sun had risen, the most cold and miserable sun that one could ever see. All the snow that had been binding the earth for many, many weeks was being drizzled on by grey, stinging rain. The wind howled down the gullies, and it sounded like the lamentations of spirits, bringing avalanches of snow down into the plains and swelling the rivers to great torrents and floods. But no matter, for in Marchlaw the fire burned in the grate and twinkled on the faces of all the guests that were assembled. For this was not just Christmas, it was their son Thomas's 19th birthday. In the kitchen there were a whole host of guests, and their faces were shining to the firelight as they smiled, for before them there was a great long table groaning with food, and it stretched all the way from England to Scotland, because Marchlaw had been put right on the line between the two kingdoms. In fact, it was one of the few boundaries that Peter Elliot was concerned by, because although his grandfather and his father had been born in the room above the parlour and were then definitely Scotchmen, but Peter, he had been born in the room above the kitchen, 2/3 of which was in England, and so he was never quite sure which nationality he belonged to. However, that made little difference, especially on this day. And so there they were at this great long board groaning with food. On the English side there was a ponderous plum pudding all studded with temptations. There were sirloins and sausages sizzling. And on the Scottish side there was a great steaming haggis and sheep's head and trotters and lots of delicacies in between. Well, all the guests were there with smiles on their faces. And Peter Elliot stood up with the carving knife in his hand, ready to carve, when his eye went to his right hand, and he saw that the chair next to him was empty. "Janet," he said, "where is Thomas? And on a day like this?" I'm sorry, neighbours, I must go out and see if I can just see him outside the door. Would you excuse me? For I cannot begin to start without him. And so Peter Elliott left the company. Well, there they stood and sat. And everybody waited, and their stomachs started to grumble. And all the guests looked up and down the table, and they started to get very hungry. And then they grew peevish. And then they grew gloomy as they saw an excellent dinner ruining in front of their very noses. Well, Mrs. Elliott tried her best to keep their spirits up, but in the end she turned to the dark-haired, beautiful young girl by her shoulder, and she said, "Elizabeth, hinny, do you not ken where he is?" Well, the girl looked up with tears in her eyes, and her lip trembled, and she shook her head. And so in the end, Mrs. Elliott had to ask her guests to begin without them. Well, they didn't need a second invitation. And soon all those sirloins and sausages and pies were disappearing, and humour was returning to the scene. Well, after some time, there was a footstep at the door, and in blew Peter with the storm behind him. He looked over at Janet, and she rushed up to him. But as his eye looked at the empty chair, he said, "Janet, there is nothing to be seen of him. I must go out again. I'm sorry, neighbours, but I must leave you again, and on a night such as an enemy should not be out in." And so he hauled the door to behind him as he left. Mrs. Elliott turned round to her guests, and she wrung her hands, and she said, "Oh," she said, "I have for days been so happy at the thought of this day, and yet even then my heart has been pulled by thoughts that, it was like ghosts pulling at my heart. And now, here is the cause. Oh, Tom, my Thomas, he's lost, maybe lost forever." Well, then a tall man in the company, Adam Bell, father of the pretty girl that had been speaking to Janet, he got up and he began to organise the crowd. He got 12 men on horseback and 12 on foot as a search party to go out with him, while the women stayed behind to console and to weep with the mother. And poor Elizabeth, she went away to the corner and she sunk her face into a damp handkerchief and cried. Well, the storm blew. The wind howled around that house. And as midnight approached, all but Peter and Thomas had returned to the house. Eventually there was a footstep outside that sorrowful house. Peter Elliott came in and he threw his frozen arms around his wife's neck. "Oh, Janet, Janet, what is this that has come upon us now?" he said. And as he spoke, he closed his eyes to keep them from looking at the empty chair. Well, years passed by, and no sign was ever seen of their dear son. 12 years passed by, in fact, and eventually it again was Christmas. Over the years, Christmas had been held, of course, in the house, but not so much for happiness, but for sorrow and to remember their son. And no one ever forgot, nor anyone ever sat in his chair. As years passed by, the edge went off maybe the anguish of the parents. And for the sake of the younger children, they brought some festivity back into the day. But it was always with a bittersweet smile. 12 years, and the Christmas was there, and such a different sun rose on this day, bright in a pale blue sky, and the hillsides were covered still in green. In front of Marchlaw House there was a great assemblance of guests, and they were playing games, the younger ones, and the older men were standing around and talking about their own exploits from years gone by. Now, the man who was winning most of the games this day was a burly sheep farmer called Johnson. He had once been a rival of Thomas. And just as he was throwing the hammer and winning again, out of nowhere it seemed, came a stranger. Now he marched straight towards them, and everybody turned round and their eyes were upon him. They could see that he was a tall, strong, burly man with a rugged, weather-beaten face, a great fierce black beard and black curls hanging down right to his shoulders, and he was dressed in the clothes of a seaman. Well, without a by or leave, he came up, gave a scowl to Johnson, picked up the hammer, swung it around his head and flung it a full 5 yards further than the winning shot. "Well done," said everybody, giving him a bit of applause. And Peter Elliott felt the tears welling up in his eyes. Well, that sailor stayed there, and he won at all the games that were held until dinner was called. Well, all the guests went into the same kitchen, and they all sat down at the long board. And Peter Elliott was just about to pick up his carving knife to carve, when he said, "Burns," he said, "did you not invite the sailor in?" "I am here without invitation at all," said the sailor, and he marched round the room. "Burns," said Peter, "would you draw up a chair for this man?" "No need of a chair, me hearties," he said. "I'll take this one." And before anyone could say anything, he flung himself down in the vacant, the hallowed, the sacred chair. Well, a hush went round that room, and a gasp that could not have been produced by a minister blurting out from a pulpit of the fires of hell. He couldn't have shocked them any more. "Sir, sir," said Peter, "you canna sit in that chair, you canna sit in that chair." "Get up out of there," said Janet. "Get up out of that chair, that's my son's chair." "Oh, sir, sir," said Peter, "you cannot know, but that's my son's chair, and he went 12 years from here and we've never seen him since. It wrings the blood from my heart to see another body sitting there." Well, the sailor looked up at Peter in his eye, and he said, "Sir," he said, "I would take your hand and I would die for your feelings. For I know that Tom Elliott was my friend." Well, the room was hushed again. And he said, "And I have come here and weighed anchor in this chair by special commission, because, take a breath now, Tom ain't dead." "Ain't dead?" went round the room. "Ain't dead? But where is he, and how, and why?" And he said, "He is alive and hale and hearty," he said. Well, the room erupted in so many questions, and every single one of them meant, "Where is he, and where has he been?" So the man said, he's hale and hearty, and then up rose the girl Elizabeth, and she rose towards him with her mouth ajar. But Johnson, sitting next to her, pulled her back down again, and then the sailor leapt up and he said, "Hands off her, landlubber, otherwise I'll shiver your timbers and show daylight between them." And the girl fell, and he caught her up in his arms. "Betty," he said, "do you not know me, Betty? Do you not know your own Tom? Mother, father, do you not know your own son? My face might have changed, but my heart is just the same as ever it was." Well, the whole company was upon him, hugging him and kissing him and smiling and laughing and slapping him on the back, until eventually he said, "Oh, hold," he said. And the mother said, "Well, but where have you been?" He said, "It is a long story, and it would take me weeks to tell you, but this is the short of it. Those 12 years ago, do you remember the weather that it was and the snow on the hills? And do you remember, Father, that there'd been some smugglers round this place trying to get some barrels into our cellar, and you wouldn't let him? Well," he said, "when I went out that Christmas, I went out to meet Elizabeth and her father, but they ambushed me with pistols, and they trussed me up and they dragged me off down to Hell's Hole. Well, we went in there long when the snow came down and it blocked us in. And when they dug us out, they threw me on a horse and they took me down to the coast and threw me into the stinking pit of their smuggling tub. Well, they took me then and they threw me onto a Dutch man-of-war where I was enslaved. Had to do everything for them for the next 6 years. But then they wanted me to fight against the gallant Duncan at Campertown. And that was a thing I would not do, fight my own people. So under cover of the gun smoke, I dived from the gunwale and I swam to the British fleet. And I can tell you, when I had my feet on that British ship, I had the heart of oak. But straight away we were turned round and off to France for more fighting. And then the ship was hit by their artillery and it sank to the bottom of the sea, and it took the captain and half of the crew with them. And the rest of us, we were captured and imprisoned in France. That is, until we escaped. But that's another story. Here I am. Tom's back in his own home and in his own chair, and here I shall stay. Well, another Christmas came by. And you can imagine that no greater festivity was ever seen in the house of Marchlaw. For when Peter Elliot picked up his knife to carve, and he looked down at the chair at his right hand, there was his son Tom, and there was his wife Elizabeth, and there on Tom's knee he dandled his grandson.